Hi class, so this is spinal cord video number 2. Now we're going to look into what is actually happening inside the spinal cord. So we said that this was the white matter of the spinal cord. What is white matter? White matter is a collection of myelinated axons within the CNS. Lots of myelinated axons in this white matter. Why is it white? Because myelin gives it a white color. That myelin sheath gives it a white color. Here's our gray matter. What is gray matter? Gray matter in the CNS is a collection of neuron cell bodies. So lots of cell bodies within the gray matter. So this is just going to be a little review. We said that the protection of the spinal cord was from the vertebral column and the 3 meningeal layers. The first one, the outer one, was the dura mater. This is a tough, fibrous connective tissue layer. Deep to the dura is the arachnoid. Arachnoid is a looser connective tissue. It's web-like in appearance. That's why it's called arachnoid, because arachnoid is implying spider. Deep to the arachnoid is the subarachnoid space where CSF flows around the spinal cord. Very important. And then the pia mater is a delicate membrane that is right on top of the spinal cord itself. So I kind of like this diagram just because it's easy to visualize. Excuse me. Here we have the dura mater, this lime green structure. Deep to the dura mater is the dark blue structure, that is the arachnoid. This light blue is all the subarachnoid space. That is where the CSF is flowing. CSF is important. It helps protect our spinal cord. It's actually acting like a shock absorber because it's floating in some fluid. And the CSF, as you'll learn once we get to the ventricles of the brain where it's made, it's supplying a lot of nutrients and other good stuff to this nervous tissue. And then the pia is the red. So the pia is the red. One thing I want you to look at is this dura. The dura is actually going out and is continuous with the spinal nerve. This is the spinal nerve out here. What are all nerves lined with? What kind of connective tissue? Remember your 3 connective tissues that are involved with making a nerve? This is the epineurium. Epineurium, the dura just kind of flows into the epineurium. So kind of cool. Here you see the white matter of the spinal cord, and then here is the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now here they're labeled. So here we're actually labeling the spinal cord structures. All these you have to know. Number 1 is this fissure. It's a deep fissure right here. This is the anterior median fissure. Anterior because this is the anterior, aka ventral side of the spinal cord. Anterior median fissure. A fissure is a deep cleft. Number 2 is the posterior median sulcus. A sulcus is a little groove. So on both sides of the spinal cord, so we have a right and left. On both sides of the spinal cord, they're going to have the same structures. So this is the dorsal side of the spinal cord. So this is going to be the dorsal or posterior funiculus, aka column, if you don't want to use the word funiculus. Here is the lateral funiculus, and here is the ventral funiculus or column. So you can use anterior, ventral, dorsal, posterior. Now we get to our gray matter. This is the dorsal horn. It looks like a little horn. The dorsal horn. Within the dorsal horn, this is gray matter, is going to be lots of neuron cell bodies. Who is living here? Interneurons. Interneurons are going to be receiving that sensory input. So it is these interneurons that this sensory input is going to synapse with. It's going to synapse with sensory neurons. Sensory interneurons. So the sensory is going to be synapsing with these interneurons that are in this location. In this area of the gray matter, this is the lateral horn, and number 8 is the ventral horn. In this location of the lateral horn, we're going to have visceral motor neuron cell bodies. They're going to the autonomic nervous system. Visceral motor is the autonomic nervous system. In this location, in the ventral horn, we will be having somatic motor neuron cell bodies. Somatic motor going to your skeletal muscles. So you need to understand that visceral motor neurons and somatic motor neurons do not live in the same neighborhood within the gray matter of the spinal cord. Here is an actual histo slide. Very nice. This is all white matter. This is the gray matter, this butterfly shape inside, deep to the white. Oh, I forgot to talk about the central canal. The central canal runs right smack down, dab in the middle of the spinal cord. This central canal is also filled with CSF. Remember, CSF is flowing in the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord too. But we also have CSF right smack down the middle. So again, this is dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn, posterior column, lateral column, anterior column, aka ventral column, dorsal column. Here is our dorsal root ganglia. Remember we said, what is a ganglion? A collection of cell bodies within the PNS. So this spinal cord is in the CNS. This is in the PNS. So here's our dorsal root ganglion, collection of unipolar sensory cell bodies. Remember, these are all sensory. So sensory is going to be coming in to the spinal cord and synapse in this dorsal horn. And who lives in the dorsal horn? Interneurons. So here is one of our school models showing you the spinal cord in cross section here. Here, this is the anterior median fissure. This is the posterior median sulcus. Here's the white matter. So we have our dorsal column, lateral column, ventral column, or you can call it the posterior funiculus and anterior funiculus. So whichever of those words, terms you want to use is fine with me. Just make sure you know where you are. Here's the gray matter. Here is the dorsal horn. Here is the lateral horn. Here's the ventral horn. Here's the dorsal root ganglion, where the sensory unipolar cell bodies of our neurons are hanging out. They're going to send their axons out in through this structure called the dorsal root, and they are going to synapse in the dorsal horn with interneurons. And then we'll talk about what those interneurons are going to be doing. In our lateral horn, we have our visceral motor neuron cell bodies. Our neurons are going to be hanging out here. Those visceral motor neuron, their cell bodies are hanging out in here. And here are, in the ventral horn, we have our somatic motor neuron cell bodies hanging out here. Their axons are going to be leaving the spinal cord through the ventral root. This is the ventral root. This is the dorsal root. Sensory comes in through the dorsal root. You're going to have a synapse here. And then we're going to get some command coming down from the brain. And it's going to send a command, and it's going to leave through this ventral root, either somatic motor neuron or a visceral motor neuron if we're in the autonomic nervous system. Ventral root is going to combine with the dorsal root, and they're going to make the spinal nerve. So where they come together is the spinal nerve. This is the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve carries both sensory in and motor out. So spinal nerve has both sensory and motor. If you want, you can remember it this way. Same Dave. Sensory is afferent. Motor is efferent. Dorsal, spelled that wrong. Dorsal. Dorsal is dorsal is afferent, sensory, and ventral is efferent, motor. Same Dave. Just look at that if you didn't understand what I was saying, because sometimes I don't know what I'm saying either. So we said sensory comes in through the dorsal root. So here we have a sensory receptor somewhere in our finger. It's sending those impulses towards the dorsal root. And here is the unipolar cell body that's hanging out in our dorsal root ganglia. And it is sending that impulse into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. There will be a synapse here. It will synapse with an interneuron. So hopefully this makes sense. Sensory comes in. I always like to say sensory comes in through the back door. Now make this a little bit bigger. This is what they call a monosynaptic reflex. Monosynaptic spinal cord reflex. There's only one synapse happening within the spinal cord. So I'm sure you've all had this where someone hits you on the knee with a reflex hammer and your leg just boom, but bounces out. That is a reflex. That is a spinal cord reflex. So what happens is the sensation goes in. It does not synapse with an interneuron. It goes straight to a somatic motor neuron. We're going to have a synapse right here, and then the action potential will travel out through the ventral root and go to, this is somatic motor, and go to the muscle fibers and cause the reflex knee jerk. monosynaptic spinal cord reflex. Now here's one that has been drawn because I couldn't find one that was easy enough to understand. So let's see if you can figure this one out. This is a polysynaptic spinal cord reflex. There's going to be two synapses. There's going to be an interneuron that facilitates the sensory and the motor communication. So here we have you putting your finger over fire. So that pain that your finger's feeling because it's burning is going to be transmitted through our sensory afferent impulses. Are going to take that sensory sensation, and it's going to transmit it into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And it's going to have a synapse with this red thing. This is our interneuron. This is a multipolar interneuron. So this interneuron is then going to synapse with our somatic motor neuron. So the somatic motor neuron will then send its action potential out through the ventral root into the spinal nerve, and it's going to tell your muscles, hey, move your hand away from the burning flame. This is a spinal cord reflex also. This information does not need to be sent up to the brain for processing. Your spinal cord can figure this out. Move your hand away from the flame, dude. You don't need to think about it. No processing going on. Now, this one I drew too, so let's see if you can figure this one out. We said this is white matter. So white matter is a collection of myelinated axons. And there's something called tracts. Do you remember what a tract was? That was in your work, I think on your very first lecture video. I said write down those terms. So let me look it up real quick. So a tract, this is what it said on your terms you must know. Tract. A tract is within the white matter of the CNS, where axons that are traveling to similar destination form axon bundles called tracts. So there's going to be lots of tracts within this white matter that you don't need to know. If you are studying neuroanatomy, you would have to know them all. And if you look in your anatomy textbook, you will see them and you will get totally confused. What you need to know and understand is if we have, say we're getting a sensation from a sensory organ in the skin, that sensory impulse is going to be sent through a spinal nerve. In that spinal nerve, it will then go into the dorsal root. Here's the dorsal root ganglion with the dorsal, with our unipolar sensory neuron cell body. And that sensory impulse will be sent through this dorsal root into the dorsal horn. So now we're in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Who is in the dorsal horn? Interneurons. So that interneuron will synapse and it will send the information. It will leave the gray matter, go into the white matter, and travel up through the spinal cord in what they call an ascending tract. These ascending tracts, all within the white matter of the spinal cord, are carrying sensory information to the brain. So the tracts are carrying bundles of sensory axons somewhere into the brain. So hopefully you understand that these ascending tracts are within the white matter. They're bundling information, sensory information that are going to similar places in the brain, and they're sending up these tracts all the way up the spinal cord. And it's going to be processed. The brain is going to take that information and figure out what it needs to do. So this is all the interneuron. Interneuron leaving the gray matter, going into the white matter, and traveling up ascending tracts, carrying that sensory information to the brain. So far, so good? So then stuff is going on in the brain. The brain is figuring out what it wants to do. Once it figures out what it wants to do, it's going to send a command. And there's going to be another interneuron that is going to send that electrical impulse down from the brain through a descending tract. So those descending tracts are also in the white matter of the spinal cord. They are sending information down through the white matter of the spinal cord, and then this interneuron is going to synapse with here it's synapsing with a somatic motor neuron. And then the somatic motor neuron will carry out the command that the brain just gave it from this interneuron, and its action potential will leave through its axon, through the ventral root, out through the spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve will carry it to its destination, to some skeletal muscle, and have its action on the skeletal muscle. So you need to understand this. So I wanted to show you a better diagram, since the other one was one that I drew, of showing you what an ascending tract would look like. So here is our sensory information coming in, and it will synapse with this interneuron in the dorsal horn. Now here they're showing you the sensory information is going to be crossing over and going, here it's going to the lateral column, and then it is going to be ascending up through the spinal cord. This is an ascending tract up through the spinal cord, and then it will eventually make its way to the cerebral cortex of the brain. So perhaps this is a bit easier to see. Ascending tracts sending information up, and descending tracts would just kind of be the reverse, sending information back down, motor information. So hopefully that helped clarify that last picture a little bit better. So now we're going to add one other piece of information to your drawing. So we know this is your dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root is carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. This is your ventral root. Ventral root is carrying motor nerve fibers out of the spinal cord, and they are both going into the spinal nerve. Remember, the spinal nerve carries both sensory in and motor out. These spinal nerves, we call them mixed because they are carrying both sensory and motor. Dorsal root, it's only carrying sensory. Ventral root, it's only carrying motor. Spinal nerve, it's mixed. It's carrying both sensory and motor. Now we're going to have these little branches that are coming off the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve, it's short. It is really short. This is small. I will show it to you on I don't know if it's the next picture or not, but you'll see it. This is really short, and then it's going to branch. It's going to have the dorsal ramus that's going to the backside. It's going dorsally backside, and then we're going to have this big branch called the ventral ramus. What you need to know, these are also mixed. They also carry sensory and motor, sensory and motor. The dorsal ramus is so small. It's small because it is only carrying sensory information from the back of your neck and your back, and it's carrying motor only to the deep back muscles. That is it. That's the only place these dorsal rami are going to be going to. The back of your neck and your back. The deep muscles of your back and the sensory to behind your neck and the back, the skin. That's it. Whereas these ventral rami, they supply a much larger area. They are supplying sensory and motor to the anterior regions of the neck, your trunk, and all the regions of your arms and legs. So this one is huge. This one is little, but they always remember they're carrying both sensory and motor. So let's see what that looks like. So here we're going to do the dorsal, just so use the dorsal ramus. Let's say we have a little, I don't know, there's a bug crawling on your back. So you're going to get sensory input that is going through the dorsal ramus because this is on the back of your neck, and it's going to take that sensory input into the spinal nerve that is connecting to the dorsal root, and then it's going to send that sensory information into the dorsal horn. And then it's going to synapse with your interneuron that's going to be sending it up through an ascending tract to the brain, and then we'll get a descending tract that's coming down and giving us commands to the ventral horn, where we have our somatic motor neuron cell bodies. Hopefully that all made sense. And we're going to leave, our action potential is going to leave through that ventral root. And it can go back, if you want to move one of your deep back muscles, it can send somatic motor fibers, axons to the deep back muscles of your back. Or it can also send somatic motor impulses to the skeletal muscles of, say, your arm. And maybe you want to slap that bug that's on the back of your neck that's crawling. That will be going through the ventral ramus. So I just want to show you that there is sensory and motor in the dorsal ramus, but it's coming from a very small location, from the back, just the back of your neck and the deep muscles of your back, small area. But this ventral ramus is supplying a much bigger area of your body and all the limbs of your body. So this is going to be much bigger, much wider, because it's going to have lots of axons traveling through it. Hopefully that made sense. Now we're going to look at this model, because I think we've gone through all the structures now. First of all, we call this the spinal cord within a cervical vertebra. So this, oops, I shouldn't have told you it's cervical. I wanted to ask you which region of the vertebral column is this from? Remember, you have cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, and sacral region. Well, this is from the cervical region. How do you know? You see the bifid spinous process here. Here is the transverse foramen. What travels in those transverse foramen? You just learned it. The vertebral arteries are in that transverse foramen. What is this? The vertebral foramen. Who's in there? The spinal cord. So let's get rid of this guy. So this is a classroom model too. So what do we see grossly? Well, we see the spinous process, we see the body of our vertebra. Here is the transverse process with the transverse foramen, where we have our vertebral artery. Let's go on this side. Here we see a big bulge. That's going to represent the dorsal root ganglion. Here's the dorsal root carrying its impulses into the spinal cord. Here is the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So dorsal root ganglia, dorsal root. Here is our ventral root going down. And then here is the spinal nerve. Here's we have sensory and motor traveling in the spinal nerve, and here we see the spinal nerve is splitting. Here's going to be our dorsal ramus. Look how small it is. And here is our ventral ramus. Huge, huge. So, let's get a little bit closer. So what else do we see? Let's try to find our dura. So G, I think that's G. This is our dura. So here is our dura, and you can see that the dura goes over the dorsal root ganglia. Remember, the dura is going to become the epineurium once it hits the nerve. So this is all dura. Here is our epidural space filled with epidural fat, adipose, and blood vessels. Here is the epidural space on this side filled with fat and blood vessels. So that was the dura. Right next to the dura is the arachnoid. So the arachnoid is going all the way around to the arachnoid. And then this big space here, this big space is the subarachnoid space. What is in the subarachnoid space? CSF. And this white layer is the pia mater, which is right on top of the spinal cord. This structure here is the anterior median fissure. This is the posterior median sulcus. Here's our white matter. We have a right side and left side of the spinal cord, but this area back here is what? The dorsal column, or the dorsal funiculus. Here's our lateral column, our lateral funiculus. Here's our ventral column, our ventral funiculus. Lots and lots of myelinated axons in here, right? They're going to be sending ascending sensory tracts up to the brain, and they're going to be receiving those descending motor tracts from the brain. Here's our dorsal horn. Who lives in the dorsal horn? What kind of neurons? Interneurons. Here's the lateral horn. Who lives in the lateral horn? Visceral motor neurons. Here is our ventral horn. Who lives there? Somatic motor neurons. Those are going to be real important. So is that it? I think we covered everything. So this is our last little diagram. So hopefully you can look at everything here. Here is the epidural fat filled with fat. Here is the dura, the thick gray thing, the light gray with the webs. Here's the arachnoid, and the webby stuff is the subarachnoid space. The pia is right on top of the spinal cord. This is the anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus, dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn, posterior column, lateral column, ventral column. Here is our ventral root carrying motor fibers out. Here is our dorsal root ganglia with our dorsal root carrying sensory fibers into the spinal cord. Here is the spinal nerve. And if you look on this side, we see the spinal nerve right here. Remember, spinal nerve is mixed. It has sensory and motor. Here's our dorsal ramus. It's itty bitty. It's also carrying sensory and motor. And then our ventral ramus, which is the huge one. We are going to talk about the ventral ramus and how the ventral rami of these spinal nerves are going to join together to form things called plexuses. So that will be in our next video when we learn about all our different plexuses and the peripheral nerves that are formed from them. So that's it for this one.